Most people believe they are afraid of failure, but that's not quite true. What most people are actually afraid of is definition. Failure can be excused. Failure can be blamed on circumstances. Failure can be romanticized. But definition is permanent. The moment you truly test yourself, you are no longer an idea. You are no longer potential. You are no longer mysterious. You become something specific. And that specificity is terrifying, because once you are real, you can no longer hide behind the sentence, "I could have been more." This is why so many people remain suspended in an in-between state. Not failing, not succeeding, just hovering. Carl Jung noticed this pattern everywhere. In patients, in artists, in intellectuals, in ordinary people who appeared functional on the outside but felt strangely hollow inside. They were not broken. They were unfinished, but unfinished by choice. Jung understood that the human psyche does not naturally want truth. It wants comfort, and comfort is easiest when reality is postponed. So we invent an identity, a version of ourselves made from selective evidence. Moments where we felt capable, compliments that stuck, small victories inflated into proof of greatness. And everything that contradicts this narrative is quietly pushed away. Mistakes become "not my fault." Weaknesses become temporary. Lack of effort becomes waiting for the right moment. This is not conscious lying. It is psychological self-protection. And this is exactly how the shadow is formed. When people hear the shadow, they imagine something dark, immoral, dangerous. But Jung meant something far more unsettling. The shadow is not just what you hate about yourself. It is what you refuse to measure. Your mediocrity, your laziness, your envy, your fear of being ordinary, but also your unused courage, your undeveloped discipline, your unrealized strength. The shadow is everything that would force you to revise your self-image. And that revision feels like death to the ego, because the ego survives by controlling the story. As long as you never fully test yourself, you can continue believing you are special, not proven special, but potentially special. And potential has no limits. There is a quiet pleasure in remaining hypothetical. Potential is clean. It has no scars, no humiliations, no awkward comparisons. Reality, on the other hand, is messy. Reality ranks you. Reality exposes gaps. Reality reminds you that effort does not guarantee superiority. Jung saw that many people unconsciously prefer fantasy because fantasy protects their narcissistic balance. In fantasy, you are always one decision away from greatness. In reality, you are forced to face where you actually stand. This is why people avoid environments that would reveal their limits. They avoid competitive spaces, honest feedback, skill-based comparison, situations where performance matters. Not because they lack ambition, but because ambition without proof feels safer. As long as you never enter the arena, you never lose the illusion. And the illusion becomes addictive. At first, this avoidance feels harmless. You tell yourself you're being patient, strategic, selective, but slowly something shifts. You begin to feel strangely irritated by people who try, people who fail publicly, people who expose themselves, not because they are arrogant, but because they remind you of what you're avoiding. Jung warned that the shadow grows stronger when ignored. What you refuse to confront does not disappear. It waits, and it expresses itself indirectly, as cynicism, as bitterness, as a vague sense of being behind in life. You may not consciously regret your choices, but your psyche keeps score. And one day, potential stops feeling inspiring and starts feeling accusatory. There is always a moment when the fantasy begins to wobble. It might come when you see someone younger surpass you. You realize you've been preparing for years. You notice your excuses repeating themselves. You feel bored, restless, unchallenged. This moment is uncomfortable because it threatens the identity you built. You can respond in two ways. You can double down on fantasy. Tell yourself you're different, that you're waiting for something better, that you don't need to prove anything. Or you can turn toward the shadow. And that choice is where everything changes. But turning toward the shadow does not feel heroic. It feels humiliating. Because the first thing you discover is that you are not who you thought you were. And that realization hurts. This is where most people turn back. They retreat into fantasy, into comfort, into distraction. But Jung believed that this exact moment, the moment where illusion breaks, is the beginning of real life. In part 2, we will explore why confronting the shadow feels like a loss, why humiliation is psychologically necessary, how being average can be the doorway to mastery, and why self-acceptance is not weakness, but the foundation of power. Because the shadow does not destroy you, it strips you, and what remains is the only version of you that can actually grow. Part 2. Humiliation as a psychological gateway. If the shadow were gentle, everyone would face it. But it isn't. The first emotion that emerges when you step out of fantasy and into reality is not motivation. It is not clarity. It is humiliation. Jung understood this deeply. Not humiliation imposed by others, but the internal collapse of a false self-image. The moment you expose yourself to real measurement, you discover something painful. You are smaller than you imagined. Not worthless, not hopeless, just smaller. And this is exactly where most people retreat, because the ego interprets this discovery as a threat to survival. The ego would rather live in illusion than exist in truth without superiority. So it whispers, "Why even try? This isn't your real calling. You're meant for something else. You're above this kind of struggle." These are not insights. They are defenses. Why humiliation feels like death from a Jungian perspective. Humiliation is the death of the persona. The persona is the mask you wear to be accepted, admired, or respected. It is not fake in a moral sense. It is fake in a structural sense. It is incomplete. When reality contradicts the persona, the psyche experiences disorientation. This is why people panic when they discover they're not as talented as they believed, their intelligence has limits, their confidence was untested, their identity collapses under pressure. The pain is not about ability. It's about loss of identity. You are grieving the version of yourself that never existed. And grief is not optional. It is the price of becoming real. The danger of avoiding this stage, many people mistake avoidance for self-care. They say they are protecting their mental health, when in reality, they are protecting their ego. Jung warned that avoiding necessary humiliation leads to something far worse than discomfort. It leads to stagnation. A person who never allows themselves to be reduced never allows themselves to grow. They remain inflated on the inside and underdeveloped on the outside. This creates a peculiar kind of suffering. They feel entitled to more than life gives them, yet incapable of earning it. And this tension slowly turns into resentment toward others, toward society, toward themselves. This is how bitterness is born. Why being average is actually powerful here is one of Jung's most misunderstood ideas. Wholeness begins with limitation. The moment you accept where you truly stand, you gain something far more valuable than fantasy. You gain orientation. Instead of floating as an undefined potential, you now have clear strengths, clear weaknesses, a real starting point. This is not demoralizing. It is stabilizing. Think of it this way. An undefined self cannot improve because it has no edges, but a defined self can sharpen itself. Once you know what you are not, you can finally work on what you are. This is why true competence often begins after disappointment. The paradox of self-acceptance is often misunderstood as resignation. But Jung meant something radically different. Self-acceptance is not saying, "This is all I'll ever be." It is saying, "This is where I begin." Only when you stop pretending can effort become meaningful. Only when you accept imperfection can discipline emerge. Only when fantasy collapses can commitment appear. Until then, motivation is unstable because it depends on protecting an illusion. The shadow as a source of energy. Here's the part most people never realize. The shadow does not only contain weakness, it contains unused strength. Traits you disowned because they didn't fit your self-image. Aggression you labeled as bad. Ambition you felt guilty about. Competitiveness you suppressed. Assertiveness you avoided. These qualities don't disappear. They go underground. And when integrated consciously, they become fuel. Jung believed that energy trapped in repression returns as neurosis. But energy integrated becomes vitality. The shadow, once faced, does not make you darker. It makes you whole. But here's the real challenge. Facing the shadow once is not enough. Integration is not a moment. It is a process. And the moment you begin improving, a new danger appears: comparison. In Part 3, we'll explore why comparison becomes unavoidable once you're real, how envy signals undeveloped potential, why hierarchy is psychologically necessary, and how to grow without becoming bitter or arrogant. Because becoming real is only the beginning. Staying real is the real test. Once you step into reality, comparison becomes unavoidable. In fantasy, you are incomparable. In reality, you are placed among others. This is where many people break, because comparison hurts. You discover that others are faster, sharper, more disciplined, more gifted, more advanced. And suddenly, the ego that survived humiliation now faces something even more dangerous: envy. Jung did not see envy as a moral failure. He saw it as a psychological signal, a message from the unconscious that says, there is something in them that you have not yet developed in yourself. But most people misunderstand this message. Instead of using envy as information, they turn it into poison. Modern culture tells us comparison is toxic. Don't compare yourself to others. Everyone has their own path. You're perfect as you are. These ideas sound compassionate, but psychologically, they are incomplete. Jung understood that hierarchy is unavoidable, not social hierarchy, psychological hierarchy. Any domain where skill, effort, and competence exist naturally creates differentiation. And differentiation creates meaning. Without hierarchy, effort has no direction. Improvement has no reference. Identity remains vague. Hierarchy hurts only when the ego is fragile. When your identity depends on being special, comparison feels like annihilation. But when your identity is grounded in growth, comparison becomes orientation. It tells you where you are and what is possible. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You envy what you secretly want to become. You rarely envy random qualities. You envy precision if you lack discipline. You envy confidence if you avoid exposure. You envy intelligence if you fear being measured. You envy courage if you've chosen safety. Envy points directly at the shadow's unfinished work. This is why people deny it. They'd rather moralize envy than listen to it. They call others arrogant, lucky, privileged, overrated. But this projection serves one purpose: to protect the ego from responsibility. If the other person's success is invalid, you don't have to confront your own avoidance. When envy is ignored, it mutates. It turns into bitterness. Bitterness is envy that refuses to transform. Instead of asking, what do I need to develop? The bitter mind asks, why should they have this? Jung warned that bitterness corrodes the soul, not because it's unpleasant, but because it freezes development. A bitter person stops learning. They explain away excellence instead of learning from it. They reduce the world instead of expanding themselves. And slowly, they retreat into a moralized comfort zone where no growth is required. Here is where true individuation demands courage. You must allow yourself to be measured without collapsing. To say, yes, they are better than me right now. And that does not destroy my worth. It gives me direction. This requires a stable ego. Not inflated, not defensive, stable. The ego that can tolerate hierarchy is the ego that can grow, because it no longer needs to pretend. There is a deep psychological shift that occurs at this stage. You stop caring about who you could be and start caring about what you can do. This is the death of narcissistic potential and the birth of grounded competence. Jung believed that real self-esteem comes from earned ability, not imagined identity. Confidence that has never been tested is fragile. Confidence built through effort is quiet. This is why truly capable people rarely need to announce themselves. Their position speaks for them. But there's one more danger ahead. As you grow, as you integrate your shadow, as you accept hierarchy and comparison, a new temptation emerges to build a new identity around superiority, to replace fantasy with arrogance. In Part 4, we'll explore how growth can secretly inflate the ego, why moral superiority is the most dangerous shadow, how people sabotage themselves after improvement, and how to remain grounded while advancing. Because becoming better does not automatically make you wiser. There is a moment in personal development that is rarely talked about. You improve. You integrate parts of your shadow. You gain competence, clarity, discipline, and suddenly, you feel different from others. Not stronger, not wiser, better. This is where many people quietly fall, because growth can become a new persona. And Jung warned about this more than most realize. When someone has suffered, struggled, and transformed, they often develop a subtle belief. I've done the work. Others haven't. At first, this feels justified. After all, you have changed. But slowly, Without noticing, growth hardens into judgment. You start seeing others as unaware, weak, asleep, inferior. And this is where individuation stops. Because the ego has found a new identity to defend, not the fantasy of being great, but the pride of being enlightened. Jung was clear: the shadow does not disappear when you integrate it. It changes shape. If earlier your shadow was incompetence, now it may be arrogance. If earlier it was avoidance, now it may be contempt. If earlier it was insecurity, now it may be moral superiority. This is why so many self-aware people become insufferable. They confuse insight with elevation. They forget that individuation is not about standing above others. It is about standing within yourself. Superiority feels powerful, but psychologically, it is brittle. The moment you define yourself as more evolved than others, you become dependent on comparison again. Your identity now needs others to be wrong, others to be unconscious, others to be behind. Without them, your position collapses. This is not freedom. It is a new cage. Jung believed that true development creates humility, not dominance. Not humility as submission. Humility as accuracy. You see yourself clearly. You see others clearly. Without inflation. Here is the test Jung would give. Can you sit with someone who has not done the work without needing to correct them? Can you observe ignorance without contempt? Can you hold your insight without turning it into a weapon? If the answer is no, the shadow still rules, just wearing a cleaner mask. The ego does not care about truth. It cares about position. Earlier, it wanted to be admired. Now, it wants to be right. Earlier, it wanted approval. Now, it wants authority. This is why arguments return even after growth. You don't argue to learn. You argue to establish dominance. And every time you need to prove insight, you reveal insecurity. The integrated person does not need to convince. They embody. Jung believed transformation must be lived, not preached. Real integration shows itself in how you respond under pressure, how you treat those beneath you, how you handle disagreement, how you carry silence. Not in how advanced your language is, not in how sharp your critiques are, not in how clearly you can diagnose others. In fact, the more someone talks about their growth, the less integrated it usually is. Growth settles. It does not announce itself. So what keeps growth from turning toxic? A return to the self, not the ego self, the regulating center of the psyche. The self does not compete. It does not dominate. It does not prove. It aligns. When you are aligned, you no longer need others to be less. You no longer need hierarchy to validate identity. You accept hierarchy as structure, not status. You move forward without stepping on others psychologically. But there is one last stage, the stage most people never reach, where the question is no longer, who am I compared to others? But who am I when no one is watching? In the final chapter, we will explore what Jung meant by psychological wholeness, why most people never feel complete, how to live without fantasy or inflation, and how to carry your shadow without fear. Because the goal was never to be better than others. It was to become whole. At the end of all psychological work, there is a quiet truth most people never face. You don't become whole by becoming better. You become whole by becoming real. And that distinction changes everything. Most lives are built on subtraction. People remove traits they dislike. They suppress impulses that feel dangerous. They hide emotions that threaten belonging. And what remains looks functional, acceptable, productive, but not alive. Jung believed this was the central tragedy of modern humanity. Not suffering, fragmentation. You are not tired because life is hard. You are tired because you are divided. Half of you is performing, half of you is hidden, and maintaining that split consumes enormous energy. Modern self-improvement often makes this worse. It treats the psyche like a machine. Fix this habit, eliminate that flaw, optimize this trait. But the psyche is not a machine. It is an ecosystem. And when you remove parts of yourself instead of integrating them, the system destabilizes. The parts you reject do not disappear. They sabotage. They leak out as passive aggression, self-sabotage, burnout, resentment, projection, depression. What you refuse to carry consciously will control you unconsciously. Wholeness is not purity. It is not positivity. It is not being healed. Wholeness means you know what you are capable of and you can tolerate that knowledge. You know your strength and your cruelty, your discipline and your laziness. your generosity, and your selfishness, and none of it shocks you anymore. This is not moral collapse. It is psychological stability, because what no longer terrifies you no longer controls you. This is the paradox Jung emphasized again and again. You cannot change what you do not accept. As long as you hate parts of yourself, you are locked in war. And war creates resistance, not growth. Acceptance does not mean indulgence. It means accuracy. I see what is here. I am not pretending otherwise. From that place, change becomes possible because it is no longer driven by shame. Shame creates fantasy. Acceptance creates reality. And only reality can be shaped. Most people avoid wholeness because it means being measured. In fantasy, you are infinite. In reality, you are specific. Specific skills, specific limits, specific temperament, and specificity feels like loss. You lose imagined greatness. You lose imagined potential. You lose excuses, but you gain direction. Jung believed this moment was the true crossing, from adolescence into adulthood, from fantasy into life. Those who avoid it stay psychologically young forever. Those who accept it begin to build something real. Fantasy feels safe because it asks nothing. Reality demands effort, failure, humility. But fantasy has an expiration date. At some point, life asks, what did you actually do with who you are? And if the answer is nothing, but I could have, the result is bitterness, not sadness, resentment. Resentment toward others who dare to become concrete. So the real choice is not light or dark, good or bad, strong or weak. The real choice is this. Will you remain potential or become actual? Will you protect your ideal image or risk discovering who you really are? Will you reject your shadow or make it an ally? Because only one of these paths leads to life. The other leads to comfort followed by regret. Jung never promised happiness. He promised meaning. And meaning does not come from perfection. It comes from integration. From carrying your contradictions without collapsing. From living without pretending to be simpler than you are. From standing in the world without needing masks. If this resonated, it's because part of you already knows the truth. You are not unfinished because you are broken. You are unfinished because you are avoiding yourself. And the moment you stop running, life begins to respond. Not with ease, with depth, with weight, with reality. And that is where wholeness lives.